Welcome to the Festival of the Future City. I've been asked to say thank you to some of our partners at the beginning, so thank you to the Arts Council, to Innovate UK, Bristol City Council, the University of the West of England for supporting the Festival of the Future City. The hashtag is the same that's been used for events so far, so hashtag FutureCity15 if you want to tweet about this morning's event. My name's Anne Cousins. I work for a consultancy called Arup, and I'm going to chair the session today with Julie from Glasgow, Sarah from Bristol, Wynand from Rotterdam, and Chris from Detroit. Our session is focused on resilience and future cities. I'm going to very briefly talk about a definition of resilience, and then ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves and to talk about what resilience means to them and their city, to talk about how they've begun to interpret that locally in each of those cities around the world. And then we'll have, hopefully, a reasonable amount of time for discussion amongst ourselves and for questions from the audience. So, resilience. One of the definitions of resilience comes from some work that Arup has done over the last few years with the Rockefeller Foundation and 100 Resilient Cities, and has developed the definition that resilience is the capacity of individuals, of communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and thrive, no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks a city faces. So that's a very broad and very holistic definition of resilience that respects the kind of the big systems that are in play in a city, from the people, from the economics and society, from the infrastructure to the leadership that a city uses. So that's a definition. There are many. Anybody who's familiar with the literature on resilience will know the kind of plethora of definitions that are out there, but that's hopefully a good starting point and one that many of our panellists here today will recognise as well. Chris, can I ask you to start perhaps talking a little bit about Detroit, and the chief exec of the Rockefeller Foundation said that the opposite of resilience was failure. I don't know if that's a term that's helpful in describing Detroit.
So I work for an organization called Detroit Future City, and we focus on kind of where Detroit's going from here. But we are coming out of the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. And before I talk about the future, maybe it'd be helpful to talk about kind of how we got there. And it's important to know your past and to plan for the future. So Detroit, as many know, we built our city around industry. We built our city around one industry, the automobile industry, and we grew with that industry. And we grew exponentially, basically, beginning at the 20th century on up, adding, doubling and tripling in population with the growth of that industry and the creation of industrial space around it, housing to support it, reaching its pinnacle in the 40s and 50s, in particular in the 40s around World War II, when the President of the United States asked Detroit how they could retool to support the Allied war effort. We basically transformed all of our factories to eventually supply 25% of all war material for World War II. That required us to add population. Within 3 years, we added an additional third of our population from all over the country. And then basically all of that came to the city that we had about in 1950, where we hit our peak population, about 1.5 million. And then from there, because it was all oriented around one industry, we were vulnerable. And as that industry decided to change, both from a number of different factors. One, the strategy of decentralization. So as the auto industry looked to expand factories, they built factories outside of the city center, outside into the region, into the country, in different parts of the country that we had not seen before, taking jobs out of the city center, out of Detroit. Our population, the population that had the means, followed those jobs, followed those factories. However, the population that did not have the means or were barred from discrimination, which is a big part of Detroit's history as well, were not able to follow. And now we're dealing with basically the result of that. So we lost 90% of our industrial jobs. We've lost 60% of our population since its peak in 1950. With that population, we've lost, when that population left, we were left with 23.4 square miles of vacant land now, 80,000 abandoned houses, and concentrated poverty that is 3 times the unemployment rate of the rest of the country. We have 39% living below the poverty level. 60% of our children are living in poverty. And we have the least available access to jobs in the United States by transit. So it's very challenging to get to jobs. Only 20% of our jobs in our region are accessible within 1.5 hours of by public transit. So that's basically you've had a city that's spread out over the region, and then beyond to the industry spread out beyond and left the region. So here's where we're at now. And then what we're doing with it. So the long-term bounce back. So Future City, we came into being a couple years ago, and what we led was the largest participatory planning process in Detroit's history. And the goal was, let's see, we oriented everything around industry before. Let's see what people, what do they prioritize? How can we have an inclusive process that says, what's the Detroit we want to get to? And as an alternative to orienting everything on economic growth, industry, we put quality of life as our North Star, and quality of life for all Detroiters. And that basically breaks down, for all intents and purposes, we break it down to 3 major buckets that get to that quality of life and we see that quality of life. By getting to that quality of life, we will be a resilient city because we'll have a number of different, in our DNA, we'll be built a city that everyone wants to be in, that's a high quality city that will stand the test of time. So it's 3 major things. One is equity. So equity and equitable growth. The jobs before, you could argue that the auto industry was an extractive industry in the sense that we had our labor that worked for it. When the auto industry left, people weren't necessarily equipped to provide on their own. So in that sense, what we're looking at is for an equitable economy, workforce development in a major sense when talking about how we can bring back apprenticeship and bring back skilled trades in Detroit. So taking kids when they're young all the way on up, including the whole thing, it's about everybody. So Detroiters that are coming back even from prison or returning citizens, how can we create for them ladders of employment so they can come back into the workforce and learn the skills, and they learn the skills not necessarily through university, but they can meet skills and meet jobs wherever they're coming from. We talk about putting tools in the hands of people, so when it comes, not necessarily looking for jobs, but giving people resources to build their own business through public resources that can be available, not necessarily just money, but just information about how to find resources, how to get the skills you need. And then taking the buildings that we have, so these old buildings, these industrial factories, and how can we repurpose them? How can we not just throw them away like they have been, a lot of them sitting vacant for over 50 years, massive buildings. How can we turn them into assets? And that's center part of our strategy. Next to strong neighborhoods, to strengthen our neighborhoods, we're talking about those vacant houses, 80,000 of them. How can we not just tear them down or let them sit there as a blighting influence? How can we look for, so we call it deconstruction, how can we recycle the materials? How can we take them down in an environmentally sustainable way, create jobs out of it, create a future industry out of it? Again, turning a liability into a future asset of a recyclable, circular economy focused on dealing with these issues and addressing them and creating jobs out of them. And so one thing Future City's done is we've released this field guide for vacant lots. How can you work with a vacant lot? Put those tools in the hands of people. So we're not trying top down. We're saying here's 30 different things you can do with a lot, and and whether it's create an orchard, to create a vineyard, to do, just manage stormwater. And residents are now taking up and doing it on their own, and they're having fun doing it. And the last thing, and that's the real transformative thing about what we're doing in Detroit, is that with the 23.4 square miles, this massive amount of vacant space we have, vacancy, what we're talking about doing is transformative open space. So we're going to flip this vacant land, this huge liability, and turn it into basically the reestablishment of a public commons. This is what we talk about at Future City. Using this land to do massive systems changes, renewable systems changes, talking about utility scale solar at a size that's not been seen in the United States. We're talking about doing massive green infrastructure systems, so natural systems as a way of managing stormwater. We sit on the Great Lakes. That's 21% of the world's fresh water, 84% of North America's, and we're talking about how can we deal with those systems, how can we create systems that manage that also do it in an affordable way, and make a high quality of life so that people can love the city that they live in, have a healthy city with clean air, clean water, and a place they can also spend time with their family. So it's not just oriented to industry, it's not just a kind of a one-horse town. We're talking about a diversified system that addresses all of our issues.
Right. Thank you very much, Chris. That's a really good story of, I think, not just how resilience is sometimes described as bouncing back, but how Detroit is really using it to bounce forward. I don't really like either of those terms, but the concept is there. Julie, would you like to tell us about Glasgow?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you very much for having us here. I'm very delighted to come along and speak a bit more about Glasgow's journey in resilient cities. I suppose, just to set a bit of context, I'm Assistant Manager in Sustainable Glasgow within City Council, and this maybe kind of gives you an idea of how our interpretation first began and where our interpretation is now of resilience. So I'll really take you back to say, and resilience initially for Glasgow was born out of climate change adaptation work. Whilst we were preparing for the very real impacts of heavier, more prolonged and frequent rainfall and higher urban temperatures, and especially in the summer, me and my team, who's tasked with climate change, certainly felt that we were progressing the resilience agenda. And it was through the climate change adaptation work that we actually came up against the 100 Resilient Cities opportunity. So I suppose this was our initial contact with resilience and our first thought around interpretation. Well, whilst we were working on climate adaptation, there was a lot of initiatives that the city was obviously undertaking. I'm sure many cities are the same in terms of looking at healthy, sustainable neighbourhoods, various initiatives around health and well-being, and making sure that people in poverty are being supported, and particularly in Glasgow, we have a poverty leadership panel that does a lot of work around improving and supporting people and recognising the importance of work and worth in the city. So all this work was going on in parallel to us, but subsequently it would come to light that all of this is really part of a resilient city, and really important to move the city forward. I suppose with this time I would really just like to kind of set the context about how any city moves forward in a resilience trajectory and how you start off. For Glasgow, the first milestone was being awarded as part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. We were awarded in December 2013 as part of the first 33 cities. It was an absolute honour for the city. We were, very privileged to be part of this. And I suppose, our first thoughts were, how is this going to drive forward our climate change adaptation agenda? It's going to help us get things done. It's going to help with our big flooding infrastructure projects. And maybe naively, that was my first thoughts anyway. With the appointment of Chief Resilience Officer Alistair Brown in September 2014, that was the kind of first time we actually got to sit down and really look at the framework that's been produced by 100 Resilient Cities and ARUP. Many of you have seen the lens. I'm not sure if we'll touch on it later, but the lens of a resilient city is, of course, now, as many of you will know, not just so narrowly focused around climate change. And our first really thoughts were that really our strategy is going to take a different turn. It's going to be much more holistic, comprehensive. There were dimensions being brought into it around social cohesion, better communities, communications, things that we just hadn't necessarily featured in our thoughts. So this was a kind of interesting thought for us. It was a change in the process, and at this point, yes, we did realise that resilience was going to be a much bigger journey for the city. The next important points, I suppose, that the Chief Resilience Officer had to do, or the most important steps, were pulling together all the stakeholders in the city. The first thing was to create a steering group of kind of major city stakeholders, people that can really reflect on the process, help us kind of direct and drive where we're going with it. And that was set up, and that's still going and very integral to the process. Over and above this, we held a number of multi-stakeholder workshops. So all sorts of city stakeholders, public, private, third sector organisations, important people from the City Council, politicians. And yes, it was helpful. It was really, we gathered a lot of information, we got a lot of data out of it, people shared good practice. But actually it wasn't until we pulled people together that we actually realised that there was another benefit coming out of these workshops, and it was the conversation. This has been a kind of revelation for us, but the importance of conversation was unbelievable. Just getting people in the same room. A lot of the important city stakeholders had never sat in the same room together, or if they had, they'd never actually sat and thought, what are the challenges for our city? What collectively can we do? And they've never really thought in that very long-term kind of planning aspect. Possibly due to budgets or other constraints, had maybe only thought in a kind of shorter term, maybe 5 to 10 year basis, but we were looking at decades into the future. And this was a bit of a revelation, and it really kind of spawned a lot of cross-fertilisation of ideas, and a lot of people the light went on, and they started to realise the importance of the interdependencies between their services that they were providing for the city resilience as a whole. So I suppose the conversation was our next big milestone along the way. So much so that we actually called our consultation document a city conversation, because we felt it was so important. Over the summer months, my team have been working to help Alistair Brown, Chief Resilience Officer, really go out and engage with citizens in a dynamic way. And I suppose really you could say we've had a whole summer of conversation with people, really sitting down, chatting about what's important to them, what's important for a city, and what they would like to see as priorities for the future. Third milestone came out of the I suppose the outputs of the workshops. So when we were looking at challenges for the city, certainly people did mention acute shocks, emergency type scenarios, disasters happening. They were issues we had to consider, but it came through so strongly. The real challenges for the city, and particularly for Glasgow, was about chronic stress, real issues around poverty, inequality, poor health and well-being. As a post-industrial city, we have we have the legacy really to deal with in terms of vacant, derelict land, pollution of our kind of natural assets, etc., and ageing infrastructure. And it was really came through so strongly at that point that these issues are actually going to be the things that are going to be critical to us to become resilient in the future. So I suppose at this point, really, our interpretation of resilience was very galvanised as a much wider holistic approach, and our thoughts moving forward into the strategy is that we're looking at 5 very high-level focus themes. I suppose when I mention them to you, you might think they're quite simple, and they're obvious things, but within that there's some important questions that really all our city stakeholders are really going to have to think about, and it's maybe more about kind of pulling out some of the critical interdependencies in these wider focus areas. So our 5 focus areas are resilient people, resilient place, resilient economies and institutions. Kind of follows the kind of principles of sustainability, people's social environment, economy. So it makes sense. We have a focus theme on emergency response, as you can imagine. That's very important for the city. But the 5th and possibly most important focus theme is around cross-cutting. And we're actually really making sure that we're making a defined effort, I suppose, to make sure that any interdependencies between people and place and economy are actually well defined, that we've got good indicators in place that we can measure the kind of progress that we're making around this, and really that, the critical factors are really made very clear for everyone, to make sure, because those are the links that are going to make the city more resilient. So I suppose our next big milestone will be the production of a resilience strategy. And this will really be the culmination of all our discussions to date and all our conversations. I suppose just to clarify and just to sort of sum up, the key challenges for Glasgow really are chronic stress. As I mentioned, in terms of a post-industrial city, it's all these long-term legacy aspects around poverty, inequality. And within our focus themes, some of the things that we're already looking to pull out, particularly around people, would be the importance of work and worth and encouraging people back into work, not necessarily paid work. Unpaid work can be just as valuable within a city and a community. Supporting people to be community leaders, or at least learning skills and taking on a bit of a kind of cooperative, handing assets maybe back to communities, and really supporting a kind of stronger, stable community. Other issues around grassroots leaders, really basically growing the city from the bottom up. That's going to take a really kind of strong focus as our strategy moves on. The other important thing is, of course, climate change is still important. Our climate change impacts, we're definitely seeing heavier rainfall, and that's one of the known factors that's going to affect the city in the future. So we've definitely got to deal with the known. It's difficult to deal with unknown, but we know these things are coming. So while we're building our big flood infrastructure projects, big critical infrastructures, making sure that we're putting placemaking at the heart of these decision processes, making sure any new developments are really incorporating placemaking at their heart, recognising the importance of quality open space and integrated green infrastructure, so that we're making nice places for people, healthy neighbourhoods, places people want to live, as well as climate-proof and climate-proof places. And also we have to look to our economy really to support local business. Glasgow had a very strong history of shipbuilding, and obviously, as we just heard from Chris, issues around maybe not diversifying in the economy are very stark in that scenario. So we have to make sure we're supporting local business as well as supporting a diverse and green economy for the city. So I look forward to hearing fellow cities' stories about their resilience journey, but certainly that's where Glasgow's gone and our progress to date. Glasgow's city motto is "People make Glasgow," and we definitely feel that people will make Glasgow more resilient.
Thanks very much, Julie. Interesting that journey that you went on in Glasgow with a starting point of climate change adaptation, and I'm guessing, Wynand, that maybe Rotterdam had a similar starting point with the threat of flooding to the city.
Absolutely. My name is Wynand Dassen, and I'm also involved in the 100 RC City Resilience project as an assistant manager. Hearing these stories, I think where to start. Maybe a little bit, Detroit has experienced a crisis, and I just told Chris that our starting point is different because we are not at crisis and we didn't experience a crisis. But in fact, we did experience a crisis. Actually, in 1953, there was a huge flooding. A few thousand people died in the south of Holland. And actually, that was the start of a program for making Holland safer for flooding. And as you may know, Holland is I think, about 70% below sea level. And that's, of course, especially true for delta cities all around the world. So that actually is our starting point to become a resilient city already. And we are very much committed to deal with the climate change problem. I think we have a very sophisticated program to become a more waterproof city. And I think that's also the reason why 100 RC has chosen Rotterdam to be part of their program. When resilience, I'm here in England, resilience is an English word. We don't have the word in Holland. And we're still trying to figure out what it exactly means. So it combines maybe two perspectives. One is, I think, it's the defense reaction towards and response to crisis. And the other aspect, I think, it's to be able to anticipate, to become a more adaptive situation or an adaptive city. I think the struggle we are in, I think it's a struggle. I call it an expedition. It's a journey. since we are exploring the concept of resilience still. I mean, Arup has provided us with a methodology, very useful. In fact, you have defined every aspect that should be covered in a city, right? We call it the RF wheel, the Rockefeller Foundation wheel. Maybe we should call it the Arup wheel, I don't know. At least those are the all aspects you have to cover in a city. And I'm as arrogant to say that every aspect is already dealt with in our cities, right? At least here in let's say the Western world. So what is the added value of resilience for us? So that's what we are in right now to try to discover what resilience means additionally to all the things that we already are undertaken. And then I get to the methodology of the Rockefeller Foundation. First, we have to define what are critical transitions for us, and as a city. So we think there are a number of transitions that we have to deal with, and we are dealing with them already. But is it enough? That's the question. For example, we call it the next economy. We use an English word, and I think in England, next economy, what does it mean? So maybe it's the word new economy. The whole, I mean, the economy is transforming at a tremendous pace. And so what is our answer? We have a population that is, for a large part, is very low educated due to our harbor immigration. So how do we respond to a new economy, to develop new businesses like Detroit also wants to? The second is what we call new democracy, or new society. People in the city are taking a different role, a different responsibility. They turn from consumers into what we call prosumers. They take part in production of energy, of food, of transportation. So what does that mean for a city to be resilient? I mean, it's a strong point, but it's also a threat. It's where's the collective responsibility? A third one is the digitalization. The Internet of Things. Everything is getting connected to each other. People need to develop new skills, and so it's just like the story before. It provides us with a lot of advantages. There's a huge potential, the Internet of Things, but it also requires new skills to deal with them. Of course, the transition is also to climate change still. And also in Rotterdam, in Holland, we still have problems with flooding already, and it's getting worse even. So what do we do about that? And the second is, the last one is socially spoken. Apparently we are not able to prevent, let's say, social segregation. It is very hard to really emancipate. Is that an English word? The people who have a low income, low education. It's a very tough problem. So those are actually transitions, and maybe also at the same time the focus areas that we are dealing with. Maybe one more thing is the focus area, we call it governance, and that's also I think the vision, and you are also talking about it. It's about participation. We consider the city is not the government, but the city is made by its inhabitants, by its entrepreneurs, by its visitors, and I think the challenge for us is to step out of our role as government and to make the network, the city as a network, think about resilience, work on resilience. And I think that's the hardest part to do, at least from the point of view. I mean, we have lots of instruments to involve people and citizens, a lot of debates, but still, I think it's not enough to get the real thing going on about resilience.
Oh, yeah. We can go around for applause. Sarah, would you like to reflect on that and tell us about Bristol?
Thanks everyone. I've got the privilege of going last, which means everyone's said anything already. I'm Sarah Toy, I'm the Strategic Resilience Officer in Bristol, which, so Rotterdam, Glasgow and Bristol are actually in quite a similar place in the process now. I won't talk about the process more because I think you've heard, or you're welcome to ask questions, but I think you've heard enough. But where Bristol started from in this resilience journey was a slightly different place in that we were already awarded Green Capital, European Green Capital, so we were feeling quite complacent, quite pleased with ourselves and doing lots of great stuff already. But when this opportunity arose, we thought, well, great, you know, this could be the thing that takes us to the next level because it's so holistic and far-reaching that it could help us move beyond just the climate change agenda or the adaptation agenda and help us have a way of looking at the city in the round. So that's where we started from. When I started in February, having conversations with quite a few in the room actually, and lots of others, what I heard very strongly was that, wow, resilience, and I think you made the point, you know, it's quite a defensive position in the English language. It's very much related to emergency services, defend and protect, and actually partly because of how Bristol is and perhaps because of Green Capital, that wasn't really resonating with people. And so we started thinking about, well, maybe we should talk about flourishing. And that suddenly got everyone really excited. You know, we want to move to a really positive place. So, although Rockefeller aren't very keen on that, and we still use the word resilience very diligently, I always put up this slightly subversive slide, going, but don't forget, it's with the place we're trying to get to is somewhere really positive and really kind of the best possible future. And alongside that, we also started thinking about, probably because of that, you know, how do we take ourselves to a really kind of visionary, utopian possible future. So we've taken a 50-year frame. I don't know if either of you guys have, which is... I'm looking at my boss over there going, hello. Was it a good idea? I'm still excited about it, yeah. No, I think it gives us the luxury of really trying to aim for something different and really break the cycles and break the norm. And we ran a really great workshop on Monday with Foresight, the government office for future cities, and it really reinforced to me that this idea of, you know, if you keep just working on the, you know, what you're doing at the moment, you will end up not far from where you are at the moment. And in order to take particularly the leaders in the city, but actually everyone, to the best possible future, you need to be able to visualise it first, and you need to be able to kind of break free a little bit. So that's something that we're doing quite a lot on. And if any of you are coming to Bristol Day on Friday, that's part of that process. So where we are now, we've got our 4 themes as well, and it's interesting to hear that they're exactly the same, really, just wrapped up slightly differently. So the first one, building on this idea of a future Bristol, is all about engagement, really. And I'm starting to think about using the word creative engagement. I'm looking at Sarah here because what I'm hearing when I go to other cities is that Bristol is really good at doing things creatively and differently, and that for sure is a way to reach a different part of the city that would otherwise go, oh, what's in it for me? So I'm quite excited about really framing that and sharing with other cities about what that means, and they're also doing some exciting things. So really, you know, bringing people on board. Sort of alongside that, and we sort of debated whether these are the same theme or slightly different. We've got something which we call structures, which is the governance piece, which is how can the council be different in this in order to empower, you know, people and build trust and allow for different forms of engagement. So there's some work to be done on the leaders in the city, that the structures, and that's private sector, it's universities, everyone saying, okay, let's pick up the stick and do something a bit differently in order to see some different responses. The third point is, the third focus area is about the resilience of place, which I think nobody can ignore. You know, our city faces many uncertain sort of future challenges, but most likely flooding, temperature differentials, sudden rainfall, and so on. So we've been negligent if we didn't look at that. It's not necessarily the most exciting one, and perhaps we're on it anyway. We're doing a lot of work on flood risk, but I think working around the edges of that, particularly learning from places like Rotterdam, to really reconnect with nature and use new ways of designing spaces would be great. And the last one is, I'm going to coin your phrase now, next economy. That's what it is. It's about saying we're all post-industrial cities, actually. There's a group of us that are working together in Rockefeller. What job's going to look like in 50 years' time? What will people be doing with their daily lives in 50 years' time? And actually, again, with this spirit of looking forward, what would we like people to be doing? Would we like them to be looking after their children more, or engaging with their families, or growing more of their own food? And alongside that, we're looking at new measures of prosperity. So can we really put well-being at the heart of our decision-making, or happiness at the heart of our decision-making, rather than just growth for growth's sake and GDP and new jobs, no matter how crappy they are? So it's quite an aspirational one, but Bristol's kind of well-placed. We've got Happy City Index, we've got the Bristol Pound, we've got lots of stuff going on. So again, I'm really looking forward to sharing that with other cities and learning from them as well. So that's where Bristol's at.
That's great. That's really nice. Point that brings us back to where we started with Detroit, in terms of not looking at GDP as the outcome for the city, but focusing on quality of life or happiness, or however we frame that. I think that I'm probably going to start opening up for questions now, if there are any in the audience. If you could just wait for the microphone to come to you. I'll take these two here to start with.
I wanted to ask a question to all the panelists about how immigration fits in with your envisioning of resilience. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in it today, and with Chris on the panel, as a bit of an end member. If any city in the world would really love an influx of immigration, influx of people to help repopulate the city, it would be Detroit. And of course, yesterday, your governor, who has been supportive of that, has said, we don't want any more Syrian refugees. Which of course it means nothing in American politics. He's not allowed to say that, but it clearly is a challenge. So it's a question about immigration, but it's also perhaps a question about who has the power and who's able to drive those decisions.
Great question. Thanks, Rich.
I wondered whether the panel could say more about the issues of economic growth and the relationships between business and the private sector, in a situation where clearly a dependence on business didn't do Detroit much good, and in a situation where certainly under times of austerity we're seeing the slashing of public sector budgets and the ability of the public sector to act particularly as even just a coordinating role, but also within a circumstance where we might not get significant GDP growth back in the near future at all.
Two really great questions. Yeah. Shall we take the immigration question first? And Chris, I'd
love to jump on the immigration question. It's a great question, actually. And in Detroit, when I was mentioning our history, so much of Detroit was built by people coming to Detroit. The United States in general, but even our African-American population, when we're a majority African-American population, migrated from other parts of the country. They were facing oppression, and they came to Detroit. Now they make up the majority population. So when it comes to Syrian refugees, we're actually very well suited. We have the largest Arab American population in the country. Outside of the Middle East is in nearby Dearborn. And then actually another neighboring city, Hamtramck, has just elected the first majority Muslim council in the United States of America. So we have South Asian, we have Syrian, different religions, or Middle Eastern, excuse me. There are Syrian component of that, but we have schools that are already oriented that way, that are comfortable with diversity. Our city's history is based on immigration and diversity, and we have this significant housing stock of numbers of houses that are currently vacant and abandoned and could be rebuilt as opposed to torn down. It would take everybody to do it, and I don't have the power to say let's bring them, but I think we have the history, we have a proven capability of doing it, and certainly with 60% population loss, paying for systems that were built for 2 million, which we're not even close to. We don't have the tax revenue to do it. It could be a potential source of not only tax revenue, but just repopulating a city and bringing diversity and culture and great food and all the different things that we love about a global city. And we want to be a global city. So,
thanks. I was just looking back at my notes from an event I was at yesterday, so where I heard that 20 million people are displaced annually due to weather events, and that's over the last 10 years. So that's already happening. I mean, most of those people are displaced temporarily at the moment, but it might not always stay that way. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has got anything to add to that question on immigration.
I think I would add something in terms of Glasgow. We definitely see it as a positive thing, and would be very supportive to bring that additional diversity to the city. We've had recent experience with the Roma community. We had quite a significant influx of Roma people, and there are now well-defined procedures and processes in place to make sure that a kind of larger influx of people like that are well integrated into a community, and there's been a lot of lessons learned that we could build upon for future. We actually put, as part of our consultation document, we put the Roma community and the processes around that as one of our case studies, which may seem slightly strange, but we actually feel that there's lots of lessons to be learned there about integration, lots of lessons for people, in terms of sharing skills, sharing knowledge, becoming a much more diverse and, I suppose, a diverse city and ensuring that communities have the capability to be flexible and kind of learn from different approaches. But we also feel that immigrants or people coming, minority groups in that way are actually very resilient. I mean, these people are one of the best examples of resilience out there, and we really have to learn from them actually. And some of our thoughts are, how do we quite get into certain communities and find out how they've become so resilient in the face of massive challenges that they've had to face. So we would welcome them. We think they're a positive asset to the city, but we also think we've got a lot to learn from them in Glasgow.
Great. Wynand?
I think the situation in Rotterdam is a little bit different. Thinking about the subject, I'm speaking as a titre personnel, as a personal opinion, but looking at what's going on in the city. We have a local government which is not very eager to absorb more immigrants. Actually, we are having some problems with that. Of course, we like to take our share in the whole problem in Holland, but there is a lot of opposition from our government, our local government. I think maybe like in Detroit, to put it bluntly, I think maybe 75% of the Rotterdam population are immigrants. And at least at this moment, 50% are immigrants from other countries. And in the previous decades, they were coming from all parts of Holland and even Belgium. So immigration is just part of our city. But in, let's say, the past 2 decades, I think we have experienced that the immigration doesn't mean integration. And integration is a very big problem in Rotterdam, I think in Amsterdam also, but maybe also in other cities, because it takes such a big, much capacity, patience, investment in education, in welfare, and so that's what makes our government say, well, please let us focus on that, and instead of accepting more immigrants. And I think resilience starts with integration, because that's also a sort of social segregation. So we need to put more effort into the existing population already.
Thank you. Shall we move on to touch on the second question about economic growth and business and the role of business in particular within that? And I think it's interesting to reflect that. I know that amongst the 100 RC cities, it's been challenging to engage the business community in conversations about resilience, and whether or not that's because it's trying to change that paradigm of economic growth, or whether there's something else in there. I don't know if anybody has got something to say in response.
When it comes to the climate change issues and that resilience, we see that as a potential opportunity for new business, for entrepreneurship. So we talk about, we've got, in addressing our stormwater issues, we also had significant flooding. We had $1 billion worth of damage, 2014 flood. That was a severe disaster, presidentially declared disaster. We had, whole roads shut down, freeways shut down, people underwater, basements flooded, and that's going to be something we have to deal with for years. But there's two ways we can do it. We can do traditional gray pipe stuff that is established industry. It's underground. It's not part of people's life. Or what we recommend is let's look at green infrastructure. Let's look at natural systems that in building out those systems to manage that water, that can be an opportunity for people to have new jobs that can't be exported, that can't be moved away, that can have a varied range of education attainment and skill sets to get into it. So you can start with people who are young, and we're actually doing this now, like whether it's the apprenticeship programs, how can they get out and, whether it's clearing brush to planting trees to bioswales and constructed wetlands, knowing the science of it, knowing how to do it, we have to spend money to do it anyways. So if we can spend some of that money and give it to small businesses and help people get those, start businesses to do it, so that when we're spending the significant resources, Detroit businesses are benefiting, Detroit businesses are doing it, then that's a huge opportunity for a new constituency that's creating jobs, and those jobs don't leave.
Yeah, maybe I don't know if that's an answer to your question. No, I mean, what I'm going to say is it has something to do with the new economy. I think it's a challenge for us, and at least from a government point of view, is to listen better to what's going on in the society. And I think, and maybe Bristol is farther than we are. Because there's so much creativity, there's so much involvement in the people, in the neighborhoods, in small enterprises, in students, in a bunch of startups, and I think that's the new economy. And the large businesses, I think it's we have people who start a cooperation to take care of elderly people. People who start small businesses for solar energy, people who adopt a roof to grow vegetables. Those initiatives, I think, and that's not the real contribution to a GDP, but it creates jobs, it creates happiness, it creates, I think that's our future. That's the new thinking.
Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to add a bit about global corporations and how that might play out. And we had some really interesting conversations at our Future Scenarios workshop on Monday about looking at extreme economic development growth scenarios. And we were doing that on a map, so physically looking at a map of Bristol and the surrounding regions, and saying, so if Amazon wanted to put a big warehouse on a parcel of land just outside the city and said to, the city council, right, we're going to do that and we'll create, maybe 200 new jobs. How does that play out through a resilience lens? And it was a really interesting conversation because all of us in that group felt really clearly that the city should be able to articulate a set of values that could then say to Amazon, actually, you're not bringing the kind of jobs that we want. You're not using our land in the way that we want to use that land. And therefore, thank you very much, but we're going to do something different. Now, that's utopian, in fact, because the reality is what would happen if Amazon came tomorrow? Again, I don't have the power to say. But I think it was really helpful to sort of go to that place and say, this is what we want to happen. And I'm sure every single one of you in the room would say, yeah, that is what should happen. That's what should play out. So I'm really interested in how we, again, if you set out that's where we want to get to, then what do we do now to make that change? And I don't know the answer yet, but having this conversation and having people like you posing those questions and challenging the city and others is the starting point for me.
I'm going to try and make this a question, a sort of evolving thinking. So coming back, perhaps, the global conversations you're having are really, we have to consider those all the time. But just come back down to basics. I really want to talk about Bristol in terms of the point you made in terms of national government. What you were saying earlier was about the city needs to create a vision, and I'm absolutely with you. You get a vision, you move towards it, and then you engage in conversations to say, how do we create it in all the ways that have been beautifully described. But this issue of 4-year or 5-year government cycles starts to constantly attack everything you try to do. What are your thoughts in different countries towards the future role of government, particularly if you take the current government's role, which is we want to remove central governance and funding, bring it back locally, but that might not be the view of other governments in the future. Can you talk about your thoughts and experiences in that area?
And are we talking central government only?
Well, I guess I am,
local?
really, but then obviously how does that influence local government too? But yes, definitely central government.
We'll take the question from Stephen at the back there.
Hi, Anne. I was interested in the panel's views on housing in the context of resilience. I think Chris from Detroit is probably the only person who talked about housing, and from an interesting perspective, where you as a city are buying back housing to knock it down to sort of create greener spaces. But we have that sort of sense of London being incredibly overheated, and so perhaps there is a resilience threat for London in that it isn't going to be a very diverse community because nobody can afford to live there. And we start to see that in Bristol as we are economically successful, as we are closer to London on public transport, the house prices go up. So I just really welcome your thoughts on housing as a sort of resilience issue for the future.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And we've got only 5 minutes left, I think, and I've been told that my only job today is to finish on time. So if very quickly, in turn, perhaps, panel, you'd like to touch on those two questions on government and short-term government cycles and on housing. Julie, do you want to?
Okay, sure. Just picking up on the question around government, that is a big challenge. That's a massive challenge, and it's something that we are faced with, continually on a variety of issues. But resilience obviously supersedes a lot of these things. I think you just have to do what you can within that political remit and within that administration that you're working with within that 4 to 5 year context. Work with the government, try and embed some of resilience in major policies that are going to outlast that kind of 4 to 5 year cycle. But more importantly, it's really going back to your most important asset in the city, which is your people, and really building that kind of social resilience so that your city's able to kind of be flexible to any of these kind of political changes that may come cycle upon cycle. It is a difficult one. Budgets are obviously a massive thing that are tied into that. But I think if you try and work within the constraints, get these bigger issues embedded into wider scale policy legislation, things that will last, and also really build up your social resilience and your capacity within your people to be a flexible city, then you can pretty much absorb. It's another one of the shocks and stresses, I suppose, dealing with political pressures.
Chris, do you want to touch on housing briefly?
Oh, and
political cycles, whichever you like.
the governing cycles one is a challenge. So, I frankly don't have a solution in the United States. I mean, we're very driven by electoral cycles. I think one of the solutions and one of the interesting corollaries would be like Future City. We did it. It's just bottom up, and the cities, the reason why it's so great to have conversations like this and this focus on cities, that's really been an increasing focus globally, is that cities are the ones with the power to think long term. And federal government can support by resource allocation, but cities can, by saying this is what we need, this is what we're demanding, here's where we've set our goal, can you help us? We can be a lever on the federal government, and regardless of which party's in power or whatever, by just saying, because when it comes down to the city level, everyone's got to work together. It doesn't matter if you're this or that. You got to work together, and it just becomes about problems and solutions. So that's my answer to that.
Wynand.
When it comes to government, I think in Holland, at least I think globally, it's a recognition that the cities are the new center of power, I think. And in Holland, our national government is really doing its best to decentralize all kind of activities, which cause a lot of problems, to be honest. But it's a good action, I think, because we are the closest to the citizens, and we know what the needs are, the real needs are. But I think it's still very complicated because it requires a lot of knowledge, expertise at a city level, but I think it's inevitable that is the future. Talking about future cities.
Sarah, I'm going to leave you with the last word, but I'm hoping that you'll answer Stephen's question as
I
well.
was going to say,
Really
crumbs.
touched on that,
We'll talk later. Okay, to address the housing issue, I think it absolutely is a resilience issue, certainly in London and definitely in Bristol. It'd be great to talk more about that with you guys. What can we do at the moment, I think, is looking at alternative models of provision. There's real interest in releasing land in a different way, in encouraging self-build or cooperative, community-led housing. I don't think that's going to provide all the answers. I mean, my understanding in Bristol is some of the problems are, back to the social cohesion issue, is that we have empty available housing, but people don't always want to be put there because it's not in the neighbourhood they want to live in. So there's some really sort of fundamental challenges there about transforming the neighbourhoods so that people are more willing to live next door to each other. But no, I think it feels like an intractable one from where I sit, and one that would be really good to share thinking on.
And do you want to just finish maybe on something on the 50-year lens that Bristol is taking in looking at resilience and how that might play out with the short-term cycles?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of, back to your question about governance, I think that I've been hearing that really strongly, particularly this week, listening to Smart Walpole last night and doing the thinking, and also from the Rockefeller. The city, the power is with the cities, the future is with cities, as we see it at the moment in this cycle. And if we have a collective effort to define our futures and set out our values and our future directions, then I have a hope that national government will follow. And actually, Rockefeller is saying they want to double down in nations now, so the chance that we might get another 100 RC city in the UK, and we can start having a really strong voice about what we understand the future of cities needs to look like.
That's a really nice point to end on. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to Chris, to Wynand, to Sarah, to Julie, and thank you to you all for coming.